short sentences don't tend to work. They do tend to lead to high rates of reoffending. And really, you need a government that levels with the public about having a sensible sentencing policy. It's fine building more prisons, but that's very expensive and it takes time. So this is where you need a more mature debate.
When Labour came to power in July, they inherited a prison system which was bursting at the seams. And while it received no attention during the election campaign, I spoke to insiders at the time who warned of the dire state of the prison system. They even suspected that it might have influenced the timing of the election too, with Rishi Sunak calling it earlier than expected, knowing that it would face a crisis of capacity in the summer. Within a week of taking power, Labour then announced emergency measures to free up some prison places, saying that thousands of prisoners would be released after serving 40% of their sentence rather than the standard 50%.
Our impact assessment estimates that around 5,500 offenders will be released in September and October. From that time until we are able to reverse this emergency measure, 40% will be the new point of automatic release for eligible standard determinate sentences. The government does not take this decision lightly.
But then came the riots and hundreds of arrests and charges. And George, that's meant the need for more emergency measures.
Yes, so they've announced Operation Early Dawn, as it's known, which means that people will be held in police cells until capacity is available in prison cells. This has been used before by Rishi Sunak's government. And as you say, the big picture is that the prisons system is in crisis, has been for a long time. This is very much where I think Labour can legitimately say they have a terrible inheritance from the Conservatives. Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, has been promoting the guilty men narrative.
And Alex Chalk, actually, previous Justice Secretary, have said they've got a point that they didn't take these difficult decisions because they knew they'd be unpopular with the voters.
Those responsible, Sunak and his gang in number 10, should go down in history as the guilty men. The guilty men who put their political careers ahead of the safety and security of our country.
The short-term measure needed to deal with overcrowding, you think has long-term merit. It is right in itself to send fewer people to prison for less serious offences. Now, the interesting question is, you weren't able to persuade Rishi Sunak, were you, that that was something you could go out and say and sell?
It was difficult, as we know, at the end of the last Parliament, to be satisfied that you're going to get things through Parliament, because at the risk of stating the bleeding obvious, you have to win votes. And that is the calculus that was taxing the Prime Minister and others.
These problems are now landing at Labour's door, and they're going to have they're announcing that prisoners from next month will be released after serving just 40% of their sentence to increase capacity, and they're also going to build more prisons. But there's a bigger debate here, which is really, is it wise, both from a criminal justice perspective and also from an economic perspective, to be locking so many people up? It's very, very expensive. I think it costs about £50,000 to keep someone in prison. And David Gauke, the former Justice Secretary, a New Statesman columnist, makes this point very well in a recent column, that short sentences don't tend to work. They do tend to lead to high rates of reoffending. And really, you need a government that levels with the public about having a sensible sentencing policy. It's fine building more prisons, but that's very expensive and it takes time. So this is where you need a more mature debate.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, I interviewed Charlie Taylor, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, earlier in the summer, and he pointed out, amongst many things, that sentences, contrary to public perception perhaps, have got longer and longer and longer, and they're the longest they've ever been. At the same time, you've got a much higher proportion of the prison population who are recalled back to prison, having been released and broken the conditions of their licence. And you've also got the highest proportion ever who are on remand, so waiting to go to court and or be sentenced. But it's interesting because Operation Early Dawn, when it was used in May, I believe, by the Conservatives, it really was not popular with the police. They said, well, not our problem, basically, that your prisons are full. We're going to carry on arresting people. And Charlie Taylor said to me, I thought it was a great image. He said, you either have to, we were talking about generally what you have to do, and he was saying early release is kind of the only solution in the short term. But he says you either have to turn the taps off or you have to pull the plug out of the bath. And turning the taps off isn't an option. You can't ask the police to stop arresting people. You can't ask the courts to stop sending people to prison. And ultimately, you have to find a way to empty the bath being prison, of course. So it's very unpopular. Obviously, you only do it in an emergency because... but we've had this sort of capacity problem for a good 12 months now. But it's not about spare places across the estate, is it? It's about where they're needed. So as of last Friday, we get these weekly figures. 1,300 places, roughly, I think, shy of 2, across the prison estate. But that includes women's prisons, it includes the youth estate. But they're not necessarily where we need them for the people who've been rioting or causing disruption.
Yes, I mean, the riots have just been a headache on multiple levels, obviously, but really most obviously in the case of the prisons, because, you know, Keir Starmer has taken a sort of unyielding line on law and order, has been prepared to hand down sentences that some regard as unfair, and there's a debate going on about that, and a debate about the limits of free speech and what's reasonable opinion and what's incitement to violence and so on. But on a practical level, it has meant even more pressure on the prison system, and this is going to be, you know, one of the defining challenges for Labour in this term, I think.
Oh, I agree. I mean, but here we have, this is a devastating stat, actually, that the local prison to the Sunderland riots, HMP Durham, had just one bed available. And it's holding already 984 inmates. I mean, another thing is that the old Victorian prisons, almost at double capacity that they were intended to be, appalling conditions. I mean, one of the things that Charlie Taylor called for, exactly what you're saying, George, is a proper discussion, a grown-up discussion about what the purpose of prison is, what they should offer, and who we send there. And maybe actually some of the solutions won't be particularly palatable, but maybe the best time to do it is your first term with a huge majority.